Well, hello and welcome back to the UK SIF Leadership Podcast, the first of 2024. Would you believe it? I'm Liza, Hartley, Media Manager at UK SIF, and with me today is James Alexander, CEO of UK SIF, and we're delighted to be joined by Emma Pinchbeck, CEO of Energy UK. Energy UK is the trade association for the energy industry. Their members deliver nearly 80% of the UK's power generation and over 95% of the energy supplied to UK homes and businesses. Emma was appointed Chief Executive in 2020, having moved from Renewable UK, where she served as Deputy CEO from 2016 to 2020. Emma, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Now, today, UK SIF has released its first policy report looking at the energy sector. It's abundantly clear to us that the UK energy sector and the sustainable investment community has a huge amount of crossover in terms of shared goals and mutual ambitions. So let's start by looking at the big picture. Since 2010, low carbon sectors in the UK have seen investment of approximately £198 billion. Across 2021 and 2022 alone, it's estimated that £50 billion of new public and private investments were made in low carbon sectors, making the UK a global leader. But it's clear that IRA has had a huge effect on the race to attract green investment, and we've seen the EU respond with sweeping generous subsidies, and the UK has been feeling the effects of this. So in the latest iteration of EY's long-running Renewable Energy Country Attractiveness Index, try and get your mouth around that, the UK has dropped from 4th place to 7th. At a time when the race to attract green finance is fiercer than ever, to be the only country that's dropped in the top 10 rankings, with the exception, of course, of the Netherlands, who moved from 9th to 10th, should act as a stark warning for British policymakers. Emma and James, what specific factors do you think are making the UK less attractive to investors? Who would like to begin, James?
Yeah, I'll jump in. So, well, first of all, thanks, Liza and Emma. It's great to see you. I think we've got a multitude of challenges from the UK SIF perspective. A lot of it we see revolves around investor confidence. As the Prime Minister was making his announcements, he did so in the knowledge that he had in his post bag a letter from us, along with our members collectively, on that letter representing £1.5 trillion of investors, saying that changes to the UK's policy particularly around sustainability, net zero, renewables, was severely damaging at that point would be severely damaging to investor confidence. We of course wrote a follow-up letter saying this is extremely damaging to investor confidence, and I think that's a really strong and powerful message. And investors need confidence. They're trying to invest for 10, 20 years. This is not short-term, 1 or 2 years. We need these projects to last into the future, and so I think that investor confidence piece is absolutely crucial. Later in this episode, I'm sure we're going to talk about some of the specific other challenges, the grid connections, the planning rules, the policy uncertainty. We can go into all of those things, but for now I think that investor confidence piece is absolutely key.
Yeah, I enjoyed the hollow laugh at we wrote to you telling you this would happen, and then the follow-up letter saying, and it did happen. That's been my life for the last year or so. I think on the specifics, if you think about, I like to think about this in terms of tangible, you could touch on problems, right through to the kind of intangible, how markets read rooms problems. And on the tangible stuff, which I think we'll come on to talk to, it's quite difficult, even if you've got investment, to get projects built efficiently, quickly, predictably. And that's because our grid policy and the national grid in general, we're struggling to connect projects up to the system, and it's just very slow. You can wait 15 years for a grid connection. On planning, if you try to build anything from a house to a hospital to a power plant, it's a nightmare process. Lots of bureaucratic hurdles, sort of labyrinthine. And we don't distinguish between stuff that's strategically important and stuff which is just someone having a go in the system. And so really need a radical reform of our planning policy to go faster. That's spades in the ground project stuff. Our markets, we managed to tank our offshore wind auction last year, which was not sensible. The contract for difference is the best known, most respected policy mechanism, I think, in the energy space that we have in the UK. And to mess up an auction, not great. To do it after you've been warned, very not great. But the good news is we now have a better auction running this year with better prices in, but are more accurately reflecting the market. So you'd hope that the market space will improve. And it's a similar story on our carbon price, where post-exiting the European Union, our carbon price has been less stable than historically, and we're hoping to see that improve. So the markets have been more volatile, less well managed than previously. Love to see some improvement there. And then I suppose the really intangible stuff is the rhetoric we sometimes get. It's general election year in the UK, so I warned all our investors in the industry it was going to get crackers, and so it has been. And so you get this language about net zero being expensive, or the government wanting to roll it back, and investors often don't stop to read the substance, they read the headline. So even with Labour's 28 billion stuff over the last couple of weeks, the communication of it was more of a problem than the actual substance of what they ended up with. And I think we're going to have to really watch that and manage it quite carefully with investors over the next year.
Yeah, I agree with you. And something we hear from our members is that, and this comes as a surprise to government and to MPs, and I don't ever know why, because investors want to know what's going on in government, what government thinks, how the government is thinking about the future. And when sometimes the government likes to believe that it has no impact on the real economy, but actually, of course, even at basic level, government spends 800 billion odd pounds a year. Of course, that's going to have an impact on the economy. But additionally, I think where government sees things going, what technologies, how are we going to heat our homes in 2050 when we're net zero? These are fundamental questions that the government should be thinking about and guiding us towards. And we know that our members look at every policy statement and try and pick apart any clue they can get that might give an idea of where the government thinks the future will be. It is of course the nature of the democracy that we don't know what's going to happen after the election, but I think that really damaging the thing that's happening now is it seems that sustainability, the things we care about, are being dragged into the political debate and discussion. Where I really would like to get to is almost not whether we should be achieving net zero, but how we should be achieving net zero. Of course, that parties can debate and argue as much as they like on how to achieve it, but I worry that we're getting more into the whether we're doing it and whether we're doing it quickly is where we might be out.
Yeah, we should, if any investors are listening to this, don't panic. I mean, the reality of it is that the UK still has got more political agreement on net zero than almost any other democracy. Only 4 MPs opposed the Climate Change Act when it went through the House of Commons in 2008. Net zero passed controversially without much debate in Parliament, though with a long period before it of consultation and mapping. We've got the Committee on Climate Change, we've got endless reports and pathways and policies which show the UK government how to do this, and we have been broadly very successful at decarbonising to date. So it's actually a very safe place to put your money, but the rhetoric politically, because there is a general election on, there are some bits of the media and some bits of political parties that think that there is much more controversy around this agenda than there is, either with the public or with business. And my worry is that we might get a bit of noise and signalling which doesn't match the reality on the ground. And if you only read the headlines, you might assume that there's going to be this huge policy shift. I suppose it's my job, your job, all of our jobs to try and smack that down when it happens on behalf of business, but it will be one of those years in the UK. Underneath that, my worry is that unlike previous iterations of UK general elections where we all go a bit basket case for 12 months and then return to normal, is that there's much more competition for the inward investment now. So we've got the US, we've got China, we've got India, we've got Japan, places where investments and the EU, investments in hydrogen, clean technology, and renewables are booming. So how we keep that money here, if investors are reading the headlines, is a particular challenge of 2024.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that we are now in very obviously this global competition for capital. We need tens of billions to flow into the UK for us to achieve the targets that we've set ourselves. But it's not just about achieving our targets, it's about how the UK can come out on top, how we can be the world leader. And, we should be leading the way in terms of, if you look at our universities and the innovation that comes out of that, why is that not being deployed more effectively in the UK? Why are we not creating these leading companies here? We've got a specific problem in terms of offshore wind. We've got some of the biggest deployment of offshore wind in the world, but the jobs for servicing all of that often is in Norway and Denmark. How has that happened? We need to really think about not just what we're doing in terms of specific energy, but how we're creating the supply chains around it. And I think there's so many win-wins here that we're thinking about the future of the British economy, the future jobs, the future industries that we're going to create, high value, high growth industries. Actually, incidentally, we think sustainable finance should be regarded as one of those high growth industries.
Yep.
The UK should be looking at its financial sector and saying, hey, we can finance from the UK the entire world's transition. But that also means getting it right here in the UK. It's not going to happen without us having the policy landscape here.
And it's economic co-benefits as well. So your example about wind turbines is my favourites, because the actual answer to that question is really simple. We had some of the earliest wind turbine designs in the world in the UK, and some of the first commercially viable wind farms just around the time that I was born. And the UK government at the time invested in the early stages of the technology through R&D, through world-class universities, early stage investment. We're very, very good at that. What we tend to do in the UK is then freak out at the point it's about scaling it up the market. And we chose not to. Scepticism about whether renewables were developed, scepticism about whether wind would be part of the mix in a big way. And the government ducked it and pursued instead things like shale or further gas. And maybe that was a logical decision for the time, because they picked up onshore wind when the price had dropped down through things like the CFD auction and the renewables obligation. And we have a booming wind industry in the UK. There is an economic argument for doing that, but what they missed in not investing and scaling up, as the Norwegians did and as the Germans did, is the industrial benefits of the manufacturing, the jobs and the skills. So we should learn that lesson when we're looking at things like hydrogen, carbon capture, electric vehicles, heat pumps, the next wave of energy technologies. And there is a genuine economic case which goes broader than just price about investing in early stage technologies here in the UK. And that is particularly true when you've got a more hostile geopolitics and when the cost of projects are going up because you can't access supply chains, or you can't access commodities, you can't access skilled jobs. So all of the things that you said, and that's the answer to the original question.
I mean, there's also this big problem that the US seems to be tackling head on, which is the creation of new industries. And you mentioned hydrogen, and I think it's a really classic example. At the moment, you know, there are no factories across the country producing hydrogen and in large quantities, and the reason why is because there's no industrial demand for hydrogen in large quantities. But the reason why no one's demanding it is because there's no opportunity to create it. So why would you build a hydrogen-powered furnace or anything else? So how do we, when you've got a chicken and egg problem like that, how do you stimulate that supply and demand? And that's where we think that the government in the US is doing one side of that equation. Well, we're now seeing companies building hydrogen factories with subsidy, even with no customers. And after a while, that subsidy can be withdrawn because you give out free hydrogen. Eventually, you're going to create an ecosystem around that factory of large, heavy industrial users, and that will snowball from there. Does that mean the US has won the battle for hydrogen? And that, how much of a shame that would be for the UK?
I don't think it has to just be about subsidy. And I mean, the US is a good example. You can just subsidise things. That is a legitimate economic strategy, particularly as has been the case in the US. You know that you're going to get private capital investing on top of any public spending that you put in. So I think estimates vary, but for every dollar spent in the US on the Inflation Reduction Act, they've had between $3 and $6 back, depending on whether you read the optimistic estimates or the less optimistic ones. But in any case, it unlocks private financing in technologies which are early stage. It's legitimate. In the UK, we're relatively far down the emissions reduction curve, and you'll hear our politicians making that argument, we shouldn't throw subsidies in this, we should do something different. The something different is planning and grid, because the reason that we don't locate factories here and industries here, apart from power pricing or signalling from government or subsidy, is about how easy is it to build the project and get the labour in and just literally get the thing off the ground. And we do have a very difficult planning framework in the UK, and we lack that strategic industrial vision. So on carbon capture, it's about someone saying, here's Port Talbot, here's Scunthorpe, here's Teesside, here's where the industrial clusters are, and bringing that together with the challenge that we have in the energy sector, which is where are we going to put our decarbonised power generation, where are we going to put the demand for hydrogen, where it exists in the energy system. And at the moment, those two trains of thought in government are happening almost entirely independently of others. So we've got a pathway for industrial decarbonisation, a pathway for the energy sector, a pathway for agricultural decarbonisation. Sometimes it's about the bureaucracy in government, it's not about the money. And I think that's what we could try and do well here in the UK. We used to be well known for good governance.
I think that brings us
Sorry.
on really nicely to our next question. I really feel like you two could talk.
We don't.
Fantastic. I think that brings us on really nicely because, of course, you know, the recommendations that we're setting out in this report that we're launching today is really giving that other side of the coin to the crowding in argument, right? We have talked extensively now about the leadership opportunities that exist. And it's very clear that there are some really simple things that could be done to actually unlock so much private capital and also innovation opportunities, jobs, etc. James, perhaps you could run us through the specific, just for our listeners who might not have yet had a chance to actually read the report, which will have been released very, very recently upon listening. Could you read us the actual policy asks as they exist, and then we can go into a little bit more detail about exactly what those policies could potentially unlock?
Yeah, thanks, Liza. And you won't be surprised, or at least I'm relieved to hear that what we've just talked about, Emma, is totally lined up with what we're calling for. And that's not a surprise because we've based a lot of it on what you and the industry have been calling for. And we're giving an investor overlay to all of this. And it's basically saying this is not just the energy industry that's saying this is the investment community that's also saying this is what's causing us to not invest here right now. And here's some ways that we can fix that. And to your point, it's not about subsidy, you're right. We don't need to open the checkbook because we know that there isn't necessarily a lot in the checkbook. It's about fixing some of the other enabling conditions and making us a comparatively better place to invest than by putting that money in the US or the EU or elsewhere. And so we've got 3 top-level recommendations. One is overhauling the planning rules, removing the obstacles to get large energy projects online. So that includes the consenting process, that includes the policy statements, and it also, we talked about wind a minute ago, it means removing that de facto ban on onshore wind. And I think had we done that some time ago in the last winter that we just had, the big winter that we just had, we reckon, or the data shows that £800 million would have been saved on household energy bills. It's a staggering amount. So that's policy recommendation number 1. And number 2, ensuring there's adequate grid capacity and reducing connection times. Again, something you mentioned a minute ago. So part of that is about Ofgem allowing more private investment into the grid, making sure that the money that our members are holding can go into the grid as well as going into the actual projects that connect to the grid, and creating that spatial energy plan. So having the real strategy for the UK, where the grid needs to be, how we need to build that up. If we're to get to net zero energy by 2030 or 2035, which are the various plans, we're going to need to figure out how to get the grid online and get the grid connected properly. And the third is reforming the energy pricing mechanisms, which would incentivize long-term investment in UK low carbon power capacity. And also that looks at the contracts for different process and using that to incentivize supply chain investment. And so all things that we've talked about already in this podcast. So that means government looking at generation, not necessarily budget, so generation needed for the contracts for different process, supply chain investment, and there's probably a skills component there too, and reviewing electricity market arrangements. So these are the core things we're talking about, and we think that if these changes, which don't necessarily have to cost money, in fact we've costed out a lot of these to say actually they're not things that are going to cost money per se. They might be a bit more politically challenging, but they're not fiscally challenging, and so these are things that could make a really key difference. We've done a lot of work with our members, but also with the wider energy industry on figuring out these recommendations.
Yep, I mean they're all the right ones, so well done. Pleased to see that you heard some of them from us. But I think that when I try and think about your world, because you're thinking about what the energy sector needs, but fundamentally a lot of what we're thinking about in policy is, well, how do we unlock private investment? You know, we're a market also. We know that we can't rely on public capital, particularly with the needs for public investment into every other bit of the economy. So what can we do to make your life easier is where we start with lots of our policy asks. Basically, there's 2 things you're trying to do. You're trying to underwrite risk. So new technologies, novel technologies, attracting venture capital and attracting that sort of investment. Often you have mechanisms in place to smooth the returns or to de-risk the investment, particularly in early stages, and that's behind a lot of what we ask for in market design. The other thing that we're often thinking about is stability over 25 years. So it's infrastructure investment. Basically, we're building an absolute ton of infrastructure, absolutely loads of it, 2 to 3 times the power sector that we've got today in the next couple of decades. You're talking about 7 times the amount of infrastructure we've ever built over the next decade for grid versus the previous 3 decades. It's like a massive infrastructure program. You will know that the kinds of investors that want to invest in infrastructure need more certain returns. If you're going to get cheap capital, it needs to be things like pension funds. It needs to be really almost fully de-risked, and certainly over a long period of time. And so then you're looking at, if you've got a grid connection that's 15 years away, if you've got a planning system where you've got a project that may or may not come through or might fall down in 10 years' time at the last hurdle, if you've got a policy mechanism that might change, if you're subject to prices that are really vague, you've got a real challenge there. So a lot of what we're asking for is about that. It's about how do we get cheap capital in. The complete corollary of that is on the other end of the system with heat pumps, electric vehicles, wheezy technologies in people's homes, we're trying to do all of that de-risking, having these kind of big markets for things, underwriting the risk, smoothing the pricing tool. At the same time, trying to create spiky, more interesting markets where people can invest in things like storage or batteries or heat pumps or EVs, which rely on that fluctuation. That's where the market is. It's a really fascinating design question. I mean, fundamentally, there's just a lot to do. And if I stand back and look at it, we're at the point in the energy transition where we've just piled loads of new technology into a market design and a system built for a previous set of technologies. And all of the reforms you suggested are sensible ones to get us moving in the direction of a market that works for the 21st century. And hopefully means that we get all of your money. Please and thank you.
Yeah, and there's real life examples here as well. So this is, as I said, we spent quite a lot of time with our members working this out. Or, we've had members talking to us about real life examples of projects that they would love to invest in. That they tick every box of things they want to invest in. Renewable energy projects, battery storage projects as well, which I didn't even think were yet commercially viable. But there's huge investments wanting to go in those. They say that the one thing that stops that project is the 15-year grid connection time.
Yes.
Who's going to invest in something that has to sit dormant for 15 years before it can be plugged in and make any money?
But then it's more complex than that, right? Because one of the reasons for that 15-year queue is the amount of sort of speculative investment or projects which are essentially not going to get built that are sitting in the queue. And we do first come, first serve grid connections in the UK. Some of that is changing because we've now got something called the Connections Action Plan and the Transmission Acceleration Plan, which are about fundamentally speeding up the queue, trying to get more stuff built. But a lot of that queue is made up of projects that are sat there with investors that thought that it might be a viable option at one point, and now it's very difficult to remove those projects from the queue. And so I think it's quite likely that in the next iteration of what we do on grid, it's not just about speeding the process up, it's also about being able to work out in the market which projects are good, because we have to find a way of going faster.
Which is why we need the strategic spatial energy plan.
It's why you're going to need, I suppose, government or a price signal or some other thing to say to projects in the queue, you are not getting built right now. That's going to freak out some investors. But nevertheless, there's no way either the market on its own can do this and government on its own can do this. We're going to have to find ways of doing this as fast as possible, maximising competition for things like building grid connections, maximising price signals, exposing business to more risk and getting investment in, whilst also at the same time having much more of a plan for where we're going.
The report suggests lifting the onshore wind ban. James and Emma, while the government's made some changes, do you think they go far enough? How can we... This is a really tricky question.
Yes.
Of course, I really love to finish with a difficult one, but I would love to know how you think that we can balance perhaps community concerns with climate urgency. James, I know you've talked already a little bit about some of the more political difficulty that might back up something that's actually fiscally really sensible. Where do you think we're at with that, Emma?
There was a written ministerial statement added on onshore wind through the passage of the energy bill, which has theoretically tempered what was basically an outright ban. So for novices amongst you, the planning framework from 2015 has basically made an exemption for onshore wind, which effectively means you can't build it in England. And the government has recognised that was economically pretty suicidal. Onshore wind is the cheapest form of generation likely. I mean, we haven't built any for a while, so it's hard to say. But offshore wind and onshore wind, cheapest forms of power in the UK. We just went through our gas prices where you're absolutely right. Had we had onshore wind on the system, people would have saved about 180 quid on the average bill in combination with the energy efficiency policy that was also cut at the same time. The issue is political, actually. It's not about communities. So when you poll communities across the UK, most of them are in favour of onshore wind. There is a small group of largely backbench MPs that were opposed to wind turbines, largely on aesthetic grounds. And there is a case for mismanaging how we developed those projects in the past, the feeling that kind of communities or people who didn't like them were overridden by the industry meant that we got this outright ban. So it's not about the economics, and it's not really about how communities feel. It's about having an answer to the political problem. The written ministerial statement that the Secretary of State put forward last year goes a little bit further to address the problem, but it's still really difficult to see how any projects could come through. You just need the ban to be removed. For me, that probably means assuaging some of the politics with an offer, and that will look like community benefit of some kind, I think. Because my experience is if communities can directly financially benefit from infrastructure, even people that are opposed to them on aesthetic or other grounds are likely to think that they're a good idea, particularly in the cost of living crisis. And so there's lots of good ideas out there about business models that already exist where people living in a certain radius of a wind farm get a discount on their energy bill, or the more traditional kind of community benefit where they get a sports hall or an investment in a local charity, but we have to do more there. And there are proposals at the moment on that. Just stepping back from it though, I think it's really important to say that you need to do this because it's in the interests of everyone in the economy. So there is a £50 billion a year penalty, we think, from not doing net zero ambitiously to the economy, because the exposure to fossil fuel pricing in the long run and the likelihood of further gas price spikes in the future, that's 2050. There is a £140 billion net benefit to the UK for doing net zero to not doing it. That's the size of the UK manufacturing sector. When we talk about balancing community concerns, there also needs to be the flip side of the conversation, which is this is in the national interest, and sometimes we're going to do it because it's in the benefit of people outside your community who might not have access to a wind farm locally but would like cheap bills in the long run. The political challenge is not falling over to every community that thinks they don't want a wind farm. It's making the case to them that this is in the national interest. And so yes, we should do community benefits, but we should also be absolutely clear that for people living in high-rise buildings in central London, this is the right thing to do, and you have to have a wind farm sometimes in your neighbourhood because it's good for the economy as a whole.
Yeah, I can't argue with any of those things.
That's feisty.
But that's all absolutely aligned with what we're saying. You know, there is a huge need for people to think about this in the round, to see finance as a part of a positive part of the solution here as well. And for this, you know, these benefits can be drawn from having created the situation for private finance to be involved and to help create these solutions. You know, financiers are people too. They want to see these positive benefits to their community and to the UK as well. So you know, I think that's all about how we can create the enabling conditions for this to work. And treating wind farms like any other piece of infrastructure from a planning perspective, I think, is the right way to do this, and that's what we're calling it.
There's a boring technical answer which I should probably get on the record, which is you can, as government, distinguish things that you think are in the national interest. So, you know, this power station is important because we need it for London, or offshore wind is in the national interest. And projects which are much more able to be disputed at community level, and you can have a twin track planning system. We have that already, we have national policy statements. The ask from industry has been to widen those to consider the technologies of the 21st century, so to make sure that they include offshore wind, onshore wind and solar where appropriate, substations and so on, so that we can build stuff that we know that we need to run the economy, and then the stuff that we're building, and it could be built in a number of places, batteries, onshore wind, flexible generation, other stuff in the system. You can have markets and competition and a longer planning process and more engagement over it and more community benefits, but you have to get that balance right between the two.
Yeah, and I think that's partly why we're calling for these changes in planning, because it requires some really bold political decisions. And we know that this is not all straightforward, that there is local opposition, that there are concerns. So part of it is assuaging local opposition, part of it is saying we have to look to the future and we have to be bold and think about what is critical infrastructure for the UK, for the future. And as we're doing that, creating the conditions for those projects to move forward, rather than waiting 10 years and the future arrives and we haven't built the infrastructure that we need.
Yep. And very last, we haven't talked about it much, but we are getting technologies increasingly in homes that will benefit from this change on the big infrastructure side of things. And while it's a more nascent investment market, things like heat pumps, things like energy efficiency, green mortgages, household level financing, that is going to be a really rich market. And one way of getting communities, politicians, business leaders more actively supportive of the transition is that we're moving from it all being about big plant at the end of the system to stuff you have in your home. And so making sure we've got a policy design where you've got cheap electricity so you can have an EV or a heat pump, where you've got markets where you have interesting tariffs from your suppliers, where that bit of the system is really dynamic. Sometimes if you just start at that end and ask what the better consumer proposition is that would make you want to buy this stuff, we're much more likely then to be like, oh, maybe I need a wind farm so that I can run my EV cheaply. That is a really neat way of looking at the problem. It does sometimes lead to some different conclusions, but I think I've got the full range of views in my membership, so I do try and think about what the customer proposition is doing. Maybe we don't need government to be as interventionist, maybe we just need to sell the product better.
Focus on the demand side of it.
Yeah. If you really want these technologies in your home, like we wanted iPhones in our pocket, then you're more likely to buy the technology that supports them.
The danger and the challenge that we've got to address is that you potentially end up with the richest people being served with the capacity to have those. People living in flats, for example, find it quite hard to plug in an EV.
Yes.
People living in big houses in the country have no problems. So how do we create that just component to it that doesn't, and there's probably an electoral element to that as well in terms of which party ends up representing which parts of the country.
Yeah, that's the political argument, right? If you think about the iPhone, I can remember when they were, £2,000 bits of kit that only really wealthy people could have because we didn't have credit financing or any financing models for them, no second-hand market, etc. And they were much more expensive. That was the accepted rollout for that bit of technology. No one kicked off about the fact they couldn't get an iPhone first, but we were really pleased that wealthy people bought them and basically subsidised the cost for the rest of us. That is an argument I've heard made about energy technologies, and at the moment that's the way it's going. Wealthier households will access them first and hopefully scale the market, particularly for things like EVs. For me, for things like heat, the kind of fundamentals of everyday living, I can completely see that governments are going to want to intervene to make sure more households get those technologies earlier down the development curve. And different political parties will have different views about how far you go down that. I suppose the point is the market would do some of this by itself on a timeline of its own creation because these products are things we think we can sell. The political question is what's the right regulatory framework to get those fairly, in your definition of fair, to the consumers you want to have them, at what point in the technology cycle to get the broadest economic benefits. That is not my job. That is the job of Whitehall. The job of Whitehall is not to debate whether or not we should have these technologies at all.
And another part of your job is to figure out if everybody does transition very quickly, how do we make sure that the grid doesn't go over in that process? And that's, again, comes back to our job, which is to make sure that we're figuring out solutions to get the money into the grid so it doesn't fall over.
Exactly that. I mean, again, we're a mixed economy. It's entirely appropriate for this to be both government and business together, and that's the kind of pitch that we always make to industry and to politicians alike.
And with that, we've reached the end of our time. Thank you both so much for your insights. What a fascinating conversation we've had. Particular thanks to you, Emma, for joining us as our guest. The report reference can be found on the UK website on our policy page. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. Remember to like and subscribe for more episodes and UK CIF news. You can find us on LinkedIn or Twitter at UK CIF. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. You'll hear from us again very soon.